Hello, welcome back. I got a shower this evening. Let's read a bit. Oh, I never get finished with anything. So we have to continue reading. I have a Danish video I need to put public. Yes, sorry, let's read. Yes, the wind is blowing a lot. I have to get below my blankets because I'm freezing a little bit.
Slavery in ancient Egypt. An ancient Egyptian slave market with Nubian slaves waiting to be sold. A figurine from Egypt of a Semitic slave. 2. A slave being beaten. Slavery in ancient Egypt existed at least since the Old Kingdom period. Discussions of slavery in Pharaonic Egypt are complicated by terminology used by the Egyptians to refer to different classes of servitude over the course of dynastic history. Interpretation of the textual evidence of classes of slaves in ancient Egypt has been difficult to differentiate by word usage alone. 1. There were 3 types of enslavement in ancient Egypt: chattel slavery, bonded labor, and forced labor. 2, 3, 4. Even these seemingly well differentiated types of slavery are susceptible to individual interpretation. Egypt's labor culture encompassed many people of various social ranks. The word translated as slave from the Egyptian language does not neatly align with modern terms or traditional labor roles. The classifications of servant, peasant, and slave could describe different roles in different contexts. Egyptian texts refer to words bk and m that mean laborer or servant. Some Egyptian language refers to slave-like people as sqrwn, meaning bound for life. 5. Forms of forced labor and servitude are seen throughout all of ancient Egypt. Egyptians wanted dominion over their kingdoms and would alter political and social ideas to benefit their economic state. The existence of slavery not only was profitable for ancient Egypt, but made it easier to keep power and stability of the kingdoms. 5, 6. History. Old Kingdom. During the Old Kingdom period, prisoners of war captured by the Egyptian army were called skrwn, bound for life. This was not a distinct term for slave but for prisoners of war, as already stated. The term emerged with at least 2 distinct usages: 1. Laborer, and 2. Servant. Documented evidence exists as early as the reign of Sneferu, in the 26th century BC, war campaigns in the territory of Nubia, in which war captives would be labeled sken, and Libyans, all of whom would be used to perform labor regardless of their will, otherwise or if warranted would be conscripted into the military. 7. Reliefs from this period depict captured prisoners of war with the hands tied behind their backs. Nubia was targeted because of its close geographical proximity, cultural similarity, and competitiveness in imperial dominion, and then the scope of campaigns intended to acquire foreign war captives expanded to Libya and Asia. Local Egyptians also entered into servitude due to an unstable economy and debts. Officials who abused their power could also be reduced to servitude. 7. First Intermediate Period and Middle Kingdom. During the First Intermediate Period, slaves were first defined as men with dignity but remained treated as property. When borrowed money owed to wealthier individuals in Egyptian society could not be paid back, family members were sold in return into slavery, especially women. During the Middle Kingdom, records show that coerced laborers included conscripts, HSBW, fugitives, TSJW, and royal laborers, HMWNSW. The Reisner Papyrus and El La'an Papyri depict prisoners being employed in state enterprises. Papyrus Brooklyn 35.1446 also shows forced labor being performed on arable state land. 7. If an individual coerced into labor attempted to escape or was absent from their work, they might be condemned to coerced labor for life. One of the La'an Papyri describes an example of this occurring order issued by the Great Prison in year 31, third month of the summer season, day 5, that he be condemned with all his family to labor for life on state land, according to the decision of the court. Military expeditions continued to reduce Asiatics to slavery, and state-owned slaves, royal laborers, shared in the same status as these Asiatic slaves. 7. Asiatics could often have Egyptian names, but sometimes inscriptions or papyri mentioning them would still apply an ethnic qualification, such as one which mentions an Asiatic Aduna and her son Anku. Both Asiatics and state-owned slaves could perform a variety of jobs. We find royal laborers employed as field workers, house servants, and cobblers, female laborers as hairdressers, gardeners, and weavers. If a household servant failed to adequately perform their job, they could be dismissed from the home they worked at. In some cases, servants appear to have become emotionally important to their household, as depicted on the Cairo Bowl. 7. Second Intermediate Period and New Kingdom. A statue of a kneeling captive in ancient Egypt, Old Kingdom ca. 2246-2152. A cone of the Berlin Papyri show that by the time of the Second Intermediate Period, a slave could be owned by both an elite individual, like the king, and a community. In addition, the community had grown in power and now held the capacity to own and administer to public property, including that of slaves, replacing some of the traditional power of the king and his private royal laborers. By this period, slaves could also sometimes become citizens. One method by which this could happen was through marriage. 7. During the New Kingdom period, the military and its expenses grew, and so additional coerced labor was needed to sustain it. As such, the New Kingdom, with its relentless military operations, is the epoch of large-scale foreign slavery. Many more slaves were also acquired via the Mediterranean slave market, where Egypt was main purchaser of international slaves. This Mediterranean market appears to have been controlled by Asiatic Bedouin who would capture individuals, such as travelers, and sell them on the market. A mummy's souls depicting two Asian prisoners. Between 722 and 332 BC, late period of ancient Egypt. Museo Egizio, Turin. The tomb of Ahmose contains a biographical text which depicts severe boasts regarding the capture of foreign Asiatic slaves. Egyptian servants were treated more humanely as employees, whereas foreign slaves were the objects of trade. The foreigners captured during military campaigns are for example, referred to in Annals of Thutmose III as men in captivity, and individuals were referred to as dependents, MRJ. In reward for his services in the construction of temples across Egypt, Thutmose III rewarded his official Minmos over 150 dependents. During and after the reign of Amenhotep II, coerced temple labor was only performed by male and female slaves. At Medinet Habu, defeated sea peoples are recorded as having been captured as prisoners of war and reduced to slavery. During this period, slaves could sometimes be rented. One manuscript known as Papyrus Harris records Ramses III claiming to have captured innumerable foreign slaves. I brought back in great numbers those that my sword has spared, with their hands tied behind their backs before my horses, and their wives and children in tens of thousands, and their livestock in hundreds of thousands. I imprisoned their leaders in fortresses bearing my name, and I added to them chief archers and tribal chiefs, branded and enslaved, tattooed with my name, their wives and children being rated in the same way. 8. In the Adoption Papyrus, the term slave/servant is contrasted with the term free citizen, NMHJ, of the land of the pharaoh. Often, the phrase NMHJ traditionally refers to an orphan or poor. Methods by which slaves could attain their freedom included marriage or entering temple service, being purified. The latter I depicted in, for example, the restoration sphere of Tutankhamun. Ramesside Egypt saw a development in the institution of slavery where slaves could now become objects of private, rather than just public, property, and they could be bought and sold. Slaves themselves could now own some property and had a few legal protections, although they were not many. 7. Types of coerced labor. Chattel slavery. The chattel slaves were mostly captives of war and were brought to different cities and countries to be sold as slaves. All captives, including civilians not a part of the military forces, were seen as a royal resource. The pharaoh could resettle captives by moving them into colonies for labor, giving them to temples, giving them as rewards to deserving individuals, or giving them to his soldiers as loot. Some chattel slaves began as free people who were found guilty of committing illicit acts and were forced to give up their freedom. Other chattel slaves were born into the life from a slave mother. 9. Bonded laborers. Ancient Egyptians were able to sell themselves and children into slavery in a form of bonded labor. Self-sale into servitude was not always a choice made by the individual's free will, but rather a result of individuals who were unable to pay off their debts. 10. The creditor would wipe the debt by acquiring the individual who was in debt as a slave, along with his children and wife. The debtor would also have to give up all that was owned. Peasants were also able to sell themselves into slavery for food or shelter. 3. 4. Some slaves were bought in slave markets near the Asiatic area and then bonded as war prisoners. Not all were from foreign areas outside of Egypt, but it was popular for slaves to be found and collected abroad. This act of slavery grew Egypt's military status and strength. Bonded laborers dreamed of emancipation but never knew if it was ever achievable. Slaves foreign to Egypt had possibilities of return to homelands, while those brought from Nubia and Libya were forced to stay in the boundaries of Egypt. 11. 12. The term Shabti. One type of slavery in ancient Egypt granted captives the promise of an afterlife. Ashabti were funerary figures buried with deceased Egyptians. Historians have concluded these figures represent an ideology of the person's loyalty and bond to a master. Evidence of Ashabti shows great relevance to a slavery-type system. The captives were promised an afterlife in the beyond if they obeyed a master and served as alabora. The origin of this type of slavery is difficult to pinpoint, but some say the slaves were willing to be held captive in return for entrance into Egypt. Entrance into Egypt could also be perceived as having been given life. Willingness of enslavement is known as self-sale. 6. Others suggest that Shakti were held captive because they were foreigners. 6. The full extent of the origins of Shakti are unclear, but historians do recognize that women were paid or compensated in some way for the labor, while men were not. However, payment could come in many forms. Although men did not receive monetary wages, Shakti were promised life in the netherworld, and that promise could be perceived as payment